strugglingacademics.com.
Hello there, I am Jan B.W. Pedersen, a PhD philosopher situated in Copenhagen, Denmark.
Then Andrasi, fellow struggling academic, PhD in literature and linguistics, occasional philosopher located in Montreal, Canada.
I'm David Clinnick, PhD in archaeology, and I'm here in sunny California.
Hello! So, I'm struggling to make this video. So, I'm an academic and I'm a struggling academic. My name is Tudor.
Okay, well, today we're here to talk on whether Neanderthals were cavemen, right? So, I think we all know Neanderthals, both in academia and in pop culture, are oftentimes viewed as this kind of quintessential caveman, primitive, or prehistoric other. And the real short and simple answer to whether Neanderthals were cavemen are, yeah, they lived in caves sometimes, right? Like most prehistoric humans, both our ancestors as well as our own species, they spent time living in caves. They didn't just exclusively live in caves. But I think one of the reasons why we view them and other Paleolithic or prehistoric people as cavemen is because the majority of the archaeological record comes from cave deposits, right? But this is really only part of their story. And because it's me, and I have to start everything from the very beginning, let's start with the beginning of our story, at least our modern story of Neanderthals. The first Neanderthal specimens were actually found in Belgium and in Gibraltar in the 1830s and 1840s. But at that time, they were noticed to be odd or unusual, but not as necessarily a different species. They're kind of set aside for a bit. And it really wasn't until 1856 at a limestone quarry in the Neanderthal Valley in Germany, not far from Dusseldorf, that the Feldhofer 1 specimen, so the exact quarry was Feldhofer in the Neanderthal Valley. The Feldhofer 1 specimen is the type fossil or type specimen for Neanderthals and Neanderthal species. Again, these remains were found within this limestone quarry, and they did attract the attention of the quarrymen, and particularly the owner of the mine or of the quarry, who knew that there were all these weird folks. It's, the mid-19th century. There were all these natural scientists running around. They are these weird guys who are interested in weird bones and thought maybe they were cave bones or cave lion bones, and brought in two somewhat minor figures in the history of paleoanthropology, Fulrott and Schaffhausen. And Fulrott was if I remember correctly, a school teacher, but also knew quite a bit about anatomy. And he had a colleague, Schaffhausen, who was a little more established, but interested in paleontology and anatomy. And they both quickly recognized that these were remains of some sort of human, but that they were very unusual, that they were unique. And they postulated that they were from some ancient form of human, right? But unfortunately for them, they came up against the likes of individuals in Germany, like Rudolf Virchow, who was far more established. He was a known physician. He was interested in anatomy, and he himself was no stranger to conflict. He was very interested in politics. He's effectively someone who coined the term culture war, and he was somewhat famous or infamous in history for challenging Bismarck to a duel where the item of the duel, the weapon of choice, was a bit of spoiled sausage. I like the story. Maybe it's apocryphal. And Virchow, he argued that actually these two are totally wrong. This was some sort of Cossack with rickets or some terrible disease of the bones, who maybe even during the Napoleonic Wars died on the battle or almost died on the battlefield and crawled his way into this cave and died. And that was the argument. But it wasn't long before this discussion in Germany caught the attention of the Anglosphere and some really big individuals at the time. So people like Darwin, Lyell, and Huxley. Lyell actually went out to Feldhofer and examined the cave and the sediments and said, yes, indeed, this is very ancient, very old. And Huxley looked at the Feldhofer 1, Neanderthal remains, as well as the items that were the specimens that were found in Gibraltar earlier, and started to argue that these fossils represent some early form of man and actually help substantiate the idea that humans evolve along the same lines as all other species as described by Darwin. And by 1863, you have this other person who was somewhat obscure, William King, who was originally from the northeast of England, right near where Jan and I did our schooling at Durham, who came out and argued that these Feldhofer 1 specimens weren't just some early form of human, right, but a completely different species of human, so uniquely different from us. It's not just simply some ancient ancestor of us. It's a different species. So it's Homo neanderthalensis. He's the one who coins this term. And that argument really goes on for most of the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century with new specimens and finds, the assumption that Neanderthals and modern humans were coeval, that they co-occurred. And this idea really set into place that Neanderthals were a different species. And I'd say that mindset lasted really until the early 2000s with some alternative arguments in that regard. But the point here is that really even from the very beginning of our scientific understanding, exploration of Neanderthals, they were always cast in this light as the other. If not a different species, then at least so distant in our past, right, that it really is this unique, deep thing far back there, another species, really kind of that quintessential other. And I think that's influenced our idea of a caveman and why we call people a caveman and, all this stuff. I think I told you guys before that when I looked up, Neanderthals and cavemen just on a Google search, it still came up with more hits describing Trump and his behavior and rhetoric, this Neanderthal rhetoric, these caveman type viewpoints, than anything specifically about Neanderthals and cavemen, in that first, 4 or 5 results. But I'd like to hear what you guys think.
Boy, I want to start with my actually personal experiences, not with Neanderthal per se, but with paleontology. Because you see, walking in the hills as a child, you come across different things, and then later on you remember, and of course you fantasize, and then you realize that you might have had a chance to come across something that belonged to ancient people. So, for example, once on a rainy day, I was walking in the hills on a very flat and very, let's say, fat land, like black, specific for cultivation of cereals. And there was a pile of small flint flakes that didn't belong there.
Yeah.
And they were white because they turn white in time. Then I kind of examined them, and they were very much like arrowheads. And I remember, well, I'll come back and take them. I never did that because the idea was don't take anything from an archaeological site. I knew that in my village there are 3, not 1, 3 archaeological sites, all related to paleontology. Anyway, the second time I came across paleontology was when I was teaching Macau, and one of the professors was taking me to Hong Kong, but those sites were clearly defined. They were 8,000-year-old, they're modern, actually. And there was still kind of a query for flint axes. So we did find a few flint axes. We found things that were kind of a hammer, actually. which was very rare.
Yeah.
But all these, to me, were things that I used in teaching. And when I was teaching about the ancient populations and the ancient humans, prehistoric ones, right? I always had difficulty in finding material that would convince my students of what I think about the prehistoric people. Because, of course, I ran across Neanderthals as being very having a poor hygiene in the images. They were always carrying a club. They had a unibrow. I mean, at least I have. So I fit the picture. And then there was this ragged clothes.
Yeah.
Fashion that they might have had, which looked very modern actually. Some of them were very nice, but always ragged and always made of leather, and always it was a typology. So my idea is, has it changed since the 19? Is it changing this very wrong, in my opinion, view on the prehistoric people? Because I do have data that they were taking care of themselves very well.
Sure.
And they have had very nice traditions and so on. So is this changing recently or about to?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and it is specifically for Neanderthals. There's a lot there that you said that's difficult to kind of, all unpack, right? I mean, there's a couple of different things going on. One, there's so much of this popular imagination comes from, I think, the earliest periods of understanding scientifically human evolution. Because I think maybe it was kind of so shocking, and it's also the culture. People were very interested in the sciences as much as people say now that people are. I actually feel that within the last 100 years, we're actually in a low point in that, our celebrities aren't some natural historian or philosopher, right? Our celebrities are pop stars and all this, so, which is fine. But I think that you had this real concerted effort by individuals by the late 19th and early 20th century, and this is still the case. It's just we're kind of pushed it to the right chronological realm. So there are people with a very limited human paleontological record who were trying to push their ideas. So look at Homo erectus, for example. Homo erectus, when Homo erectus was found in the late 19th century, it was this form that's even more, quote, primitive than Neanderthals. So then automatically here's your, link between the apes, the great apes, and us. And so with very limited remains from Trinil and other sites, Java man, the type specimen for Homo erectus, when these reconstructions were made for the World's Fair and for the museum, they show Homo erectus with long curved toes, right? So he's ape-like, and his hands are a little more ape-like, with zero evidence, because there were no, metatarsals that were found whatsoever. It's just an assumption. And you have another concerted effort on a big display that kind of toured the world, and I think it was even in the Smithsonian for a time in the 1930s, where the human paleontologist who was working on Neanderthals, literally, when they wanted to do these reconstructions of Neanderthals, told the artist, I want you to make them look like they kind of have Down syndrome. I want you to make them look like they don't quite have that, capacity that we have, that they look simple. And there's a famous picture of supposed to be like a Neanderthal adolescent kind of hunched over with like a bone in his hand, and it was a statue actually that was made, lifelike statue. And, to show them, hunched over, not completely upright, that's 1930s. And really a lot of people in the field knew better, but you still have some big names that are trying to make their arguments. And I think that the line of argumentation became much more sophisticated after World War II. But because it became more sophisticated, I think for some people there was even more of a need to make this hard barrier between our species and Neanderthals, even as much as they accepted, well, Neanderthals weren't that different in a lot of ways. There were still these very key, important behavioral and most likely biological distinctions between us and Neanderthals. And a lot of that's had to be changed, I think, now that after 2010 with the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, that shows that there are people today who carry Neanderthal alleles. Every one of us here most likely does. And I think it caused a rethink in that regard.
I have a comment for you. First of all, I can't help thinking that in the Danish language, there's a word that is not very often used anymore. It's called, I pronounce it as it is in Danish, fepande. It means actually fool's forehead.
Okay.
So it's like imagine more like me. I'm losing my hair here, but this massive forehead, and it's just like you are a bit silly. So it's a word you throw at someone you disagree with, or you think are acting foolishly, or something like that. And I can't help thinking that where does this come from? This idea of you mentioned Down syndrome. You mentioned someone who is perhaps cognitively disadvantaged, or we have the Neanderthal as a sort of idea of that poor fellow that didn't quite make it to the math class, but lives in a cave, and there you go. And I was wondering, we all come from different places. Are there similar sort of words or designations in that are not so kind that we can pull forth and sort of say has some kind of linkage to the idea of the silly Neanderthal?
Well, I think that's something everyone else can answer too. But it makes me, as a kid, I loved The Simpsons and stuff, and they always bring out Monty Burns, right, with his discussions about phrenology, and what do you call it, like a flat, shallow brain pan. He'd be like, oh, you have talking about his workers and all this stuff, and it's funny, but I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that there are, and I can't speak for the history of Denmark, but there are a lot of these kind of really pseudoscientific or very poorly founded, very, very poorly founded within science views that come out of the 19th century that I think had a major impact on Western society, right? It still has this hold on us. And I would say that there is, I kind of feel a lot of times when I read some, physical paleoanthropological work on Neanderthals, particularly looking at, the cranial morphology, that it just smacks of phrenology to me. There's someone who is more established than me. That's not difficult to be more established than I am, but who has some arguments and studies looking at making arguments about how kind of, and it's true, like for a lot of archaic hominins, the brain would have been a little bit more narrow, right, and a little longer, but that's also true of like European males compared to everyone else. But maybe that explains something. But that it's a little bit more narrow and longer, and therefore like that would affect potentially like higher order thinking because of distance between neurons, and it's like it just seems like another layer built on top of some sort of phrenology, really, right? And it also seems like there are differences, and there are measurable differences if you compare your average contemporary modern human population right now to their skull morphology, and particularly looking at how the brain was shaped by that skull morphology with Neanderthals today. You could get them to break out into two different populations in a t-test, like statistically, but you can do that with a lot of stuff. And the reality is, even though you can get them break out into different populations, they're not that different, right? And that if we assume that they're so different, there's species level difference, then that variability within that modern human population, you should be able to test and see differences in their capacity as well, based on their cranial morphology. But that
I wonder, David, if you will permit another question from me. I can't help think that, that it's kind of curious that there are people in this world who are so afraid of sameness, or that we have something in common with this particular kind of creature. And I can't help thinking about, we have, prior to today's program, discussed, Scala Naturae, and this whole idea that, there are, minerals, you have plants, and then you have animals, and then you have awesome human beings. And I can't help think with this particular pyramid structure, where we are more or less at the top, is still incredibly important to certain individuals on the planet.
I think it is, and I think the funny thing though is I feel like in some ways it's, I don't think that a lot of scholars who are, feel like there's this necessity to make this distinction between us and Neanderthals come at that distinction from any sort of, religious perspective. I think quite the opposite, but it's still, I think, a deep-rooted thought. It's almost a status quo kind of thing in the West. I gave a presentation on this actually at a TAG conference in Berkeley some time ago, where I tried to say that these origins narratives in our field, right? So we are to offer a secular origin narrative, and we have to be mindful of that, because when the general public comes to us as scientists, they want some alternative to Genesis or whatever it may be, right? I mean, that's what they're looking for. But the reality is, as scientists, it's like we can't actually provide that. You can just provide what we know, what we've observed. But, we're always tempted, and you have to, particularly with funding, to form, again, some sort of narrative, origins narrative. And once you start to form that origins narrative, people want to know. And I think it's just assumed that we are fundamentally different. And I think that when you start to see other things, perhaps as I think maybe you're suggesting, Jan, like that are too close on the animal and not the angel ladder, right? And if you see that's too close to that, animal rung, but maybe feels like it's grasping onto our hand so strongly that maybe there's some natural reaction there. I don't think it's, again, from a religious viewpoint, but I think there is a desire to really make that distinction between us and Neanderthals, but also it just makes a better story, right? It's like it makes a better story for us to sell, again, to the public, to funding committees, and to say something more fundamental about what it is to be human today, right? And therefore make your scientific research more valuable in general, right? I mean, it's like if you can say something that basically goes, here's this thing that is so close to us, but let me tell you what that finite, very important distinction is, then you're starting to claim as a scientist that you can say something scientifically that is very fundamental and foundational towards being a human today in a universal sense, right? And I think that's what a lot of this gets down to, is trying to define what it is to be human. Just as a side note that a lot of people like to mention, there's no type specimen for Homo sapiens. We're the only species that doesn't have a type specimen, right? Yeah. And that's important. Yeah.
That is a very important point, absolutely.
Next time, Struggling Academics on Neanderthals, Part 2.